بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فإن أحسن الكلام كلام الله وخير الهدي هدي محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وإن شر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. So this is lesson number 6 in our series, the sixth lesson from the book Taqreeb Tadmuriyyah by Shaykh Ibn Uthaymeen rahimahullah ta'ala, and this is a concise summary of the book Tadmuriyyah by Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah. In the previous lesson, in lesson number 5, which was an important lesson because in that lesson we established the essence of the methodology of the people of Tawheed and Sunnah in speaking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and in establishing belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His names and His attributes. And this methodology is summarized as affirming for Allah whatever He affirmed for Himself and what His messenger affirmed for Him, and negating from Allah whatever He negated from Himself and whatever His messenger negated from Him, without falling into four things: without making ta'til, which is to negate what He established; without falling into tahrif, which is distorting what He established; and without making takyif, which is to delve into the how, or to specify the how with respect to what He affirmed for Himself; and without falling into tamthil, which is to liken between what He affirmed for Himself and what is found in the creation of attributes. And we said that this methodology itself is founded in the verses of the Quran. In other words, this is the actual divine methodology which we have been taught when it comes to speaking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Therefore, it is not possible for anybody to find fault with this methodology, because in essence they would be finding fault with the Quran and with the Sunnah. So neither a Jahmi or a Mu'tazili or an Ash'ari or a Maturidi, in fact not even those outside of Islam, from the Jews and the Christians and the people of philosophy and so on and so forth, from among the non-Muslims, they would not be able to find fault with this methodology, because our speech in describing Allah and His essence, His names, His attributes, in speaking about His essence, names and attributes and His actions, it does not go beyond what Allah Himself said and what His messenger said. And so for that reason we are in a safe position, exactly as we see at the end of Surah Safat, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He said, Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun wa salamun ala al-mursaleen. Glorified be your Lord, the Lord of might, from that which they describe Him with, and safety or peace or safety is upon the messengers. And so from the interpretations of these ayat is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala negated all false ascriptions from Himself, and then He stated that safety lies with and upon the messengers. And from the meanings which is included in this is that the messengers, when they speak about Allah, then it is speech which is correct and true and safe and free from any type of error. So if we follow this divine methodology, then we likewise would be safe and free from error. So this was the last lesson. And so in the last lesson we broadly established the principle: affirm for Allah what He affirmed for Himself, and negate for Allah what He negated from Himself. Now in today's lesson, what we are going to do through the speech of Shaykh Ibn Uthaymeen rahimahullah, is to expand a bit more on this principle and methodology of affirmation and negation, and elaborate in a bit more detail about affirmation and negation. And there are a few essential points that we are going to cover today, inshallah ta'ala, and this will provide us with a bit more detail on exactly how we affirm and how we negate, and what this means. So let's start with the text for today, inshallah ta'ala. Shaykh Ibn Uthaymeen rahimahullah, he said, وَالْجَمْعُ بين النفي والإثبات في باب الصفات هو حقيقة التوحيد فيه وذلك لأن التوحيد مصدر وحد يوحد، ولا يمكن صدق حقيقته إلا بنفي وإثبات، لأن الاقتصار على النفي المحض تعطيل محض، والاقتصار على الإثبات المحض لا يمنع المشاركة. So in this opening passage, in this section, the Shaykh said, to combine between negation and affirmation in the subject matter of the attributes is the reality of Tawheed therein. In other words, you cannot have Tawheed except by combining negation and affirmation. And this will become more clear as we will see the Shaykh giving some examples to illustrate why this is so. But then he says, this is because Tawheed, the word Tawheed, this noun Tawheed, it is the masdar, it is the verbal noun of the verb wahada, yuwahidu, which means to make something one, to single out something with something. And it is not possible to have the reality and the true reality of Tawheed except with negation and affirmation. Why is this? The Shaykh goes on to explain. This is because if you limit yourself to pure negation on its own, then this is nothing but negation. And again, this will be explained shortly. Right? So if you limit yourself in describing someone or something with pure negative terms, with pure negations, then you have not actually affirmed anything. You've only spoken in negatives. And if you limit yourself to affirming something for someone, then you have not negated the possibility or the fact that there could be other things or other people sharing with that person in the same quality or same attribute, right? So in other words, negation on its own does not lead to singling out someone or making them unique in something. And affirmation on its own does not make someone unique in the thing that you are affirming for them, right? Now, to explain this, to put this very clearly into your mind and to understand what is being said here, then the Shaykh has given us some nice similitudes or examples. So the Shaykh says, مثال ذلك, an example of this, لو قلت, if you were to say, ما زيد بشجاع, if you were to say, Zayd is not courageous or brave, فقد نفيت عنه صفة الشجاعة وعطلته منها, you have now negated from him the attribute of courage, and you have negated that from him. Okay, so this is just pure negation, right? Zayd is not courageous or brave. This does not mean that other people are not brave and courageous. Other people can be brave and courageous. Likewise, if you were to say, وَلَوْ قُلْتَ زَيْدٌ شُجَاعٌ, Zayd is brave and courageous, فَقَدْ أَثْبَتَّ لَهُ صِفَةَ الشُّجَاعَةِ, you have now affirmed for him the attribute of bravery and courage. لكن ذلك لا يمنع أن يكون غيره شجاعا أيضا. However, this does not prevent that other people besides him can also be courageous. Just because you've said Zayd is courageous does not mean that other people besides him are not courageous. Therefore, by this affirmation, you have not singled him out in this attribute of courage or bravery. However, if you now said, لا شجاع إلا زيد, لا شجاع إلا زيد, if you said, there is no one who is brave or courageous except Zayd. Now, فَقَدْ أَثْبَتَّ لَهُ صِفَةَ الشُّجَاعَةِ. You have now affirmed for him the attribute of bravery, and you have negated وَنَفَيْتَ أَن يُشَارِكَهُ غَيْرَهُ فِيهَا. You have negated that anyone else shares with him in this attribute. فَكُنْتَ مُوَحِّدًا لَهُ فِي صِفَةِ الشُّجَاعَةِ. So you are now singling him out with the attribute of bravery. إذن لا يمكن توحيد أحد بشيء إلا بالجمع بين النفي والإثبات. Therefore, through these examples, it is not possible to single out anyone with something except by uniting, by combining between negation and affirmation. So this now should be very clear, right? That if we rely on pure negations in and of themselves, like if we said, for example, so and so is not blind, so and so is not deaf, so and so is not miserly, so and so, and we just use negations, then we are not really affirming anything, right? These are just pure negations. There's no affirmation of anything. And similarly, if we were to say so and so is wise, so and so is powerful, so and so is strong, so and so is invincible, or whatever it might be that we want to ascribe to somebody, this does not mean that other people do not share with him in the same attributes, right? Because there could be other people who are strong, wise, and so on and so forth. So if you want to single out someone or something with attributes, then you have to combine between affirmation and negation together. Now, the reason why this is important to understand at this point and to lay down as a foundation is because later on in the treatise, in Tadmuriyyah, we will see that Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, he discusses all of the different groups and factions who deviated in this matter, whether they are from those who are from within Islam, or those who ascribe to Islam, or those who are outside of Islam, from the Falasifa and the Batiniyyah and people like that, because they opposed this basic principle, right? Some of them spoke purely in negation. They spoke of the Creator purely in terms of negation alone. So, for example, they would say he's not deaf, he's not blind, he's not unjust, he's not unwise, he's not, and they spoke purely in negations, avoiding affirming anything for the Creator. Right? This is a great deviation in the methodology in speaking about Allah Subhanahu wa Taala. So, so this is something important to keep in mind, and this is really the first point of today's lesson, that in order to establish Tawheed in Allah's names and attributes, you absolutely necessarily must combine between negation and affirmation, just as we have with uluhiyyah, right? La ilaha illallah. None has the right to be worshipped except Allah. And so the same thing has come with respect to the attributes, the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is the first point for today. And the second point now, we are going to look into the attributes that Allah Azza wa Jal has affirmed for himself, the issue of affirmation, the Shaykh says, وَاعْلَمْ أَنَّ صِفَاتِ الثُّبُوتِيَّةِ التي وصف الله بها نفسه كلها صفات كمال والغالب فيها التفصيل. He said, you should know that the attributes which Allah has affirmed, which He's described Himself with, all of them are attributes of perfection, and overwhelmingly they are mentioned specifically or in detail. So in other words, when it comes to affirming something for himself, what do we see? We see that everything is mentioned specifically and with great variation and in great detail. And this is the general principle as it relates to affirmation. When it comes to affirmation, it is done in a specific sense and a detailed sense. Meaning here that when we look in the Quran, when we look in the Sunnah, we see names for Allah specifically mentioned. We see attributes for Allah specifically mentioned. Allah is Ar-Rahman, Allah is Ar-Rahim, Al-Malik, Al-Qudus, As-Salam, and so on and so forth, Al-Alim, Al-Hakim, Al-Aziz, and so on. Right? Mentioned specifically and extensively in detail. And similarly with the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why is this? It is because this way of enumerating in detail and extensively the attributes of perfection, then this manifests the perfection of the one being described. Right? And every time you learn something new, every time you hear of something of a name or an attribute that you never knew before, then it increases in the perfection. And so the Shaykh says, لأنه كلما كثر الإخبار عنها وتنوعت دلالتها ظهر من كمال الموصوف بها ما لم يكن معلوما من قبل. And this is because every time you are informed of the names or attributes of Allah, and they are mentioned with variation, lots of variation, then as a result of that, there appears the perfection of the one being described with these names and attributes, which was not apparent before, which was not known before. And for this reason, وَلِهَذَا كَانَتِ الصِّفَاتُ الثُّبُوتِيَّةِ التي أخبر الله بها عن نفسه أكثر من الصفات المنفية التي نفاها الله عن نفسه. This is why you will find that the attributes that Allah has informed us about with respect to Himself, they are greater, more numerous than the attributes which He has negated, the negated attributes which Allah has negated from Himself. So here then we find, as the Shaykh goes on to explain, he gives an illustration to illustrate this point. Imagine you have a man, and the man is described as dhaki, and it is said fulanun dhaki. This man is intelligent. So now you have knowledge that the man is intelligent, and obviously this is a praise for him. Now if you are told in addition that he is aqil, one who comprehends well, once again, with this additional title or name or attribute, there is additional perfection that you now know of him. And if you were to say wa'alimun, and he's an alim, then there's another level of perfection which becomes apparent to you. And if you were then told that he is shuja'un, that he is also courageous and brave, and then you were told he is karimun, he is generous, then more and more of his perfection in his being, in his character, would become evident to you. And so this is the nature of affirmatory attributes which are affirmed. The more they increase, the more they are varied, the greater the perfection of the one being described with them becomes apparent to the listener. And this is what we see in the Quran and the Sunnah, right? It is the mention in detail and with great variation, the affirmed names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because this is what indicates the perfection of the one being described. That when you affirm specifically and in detail, right? And this is the methodology of the Quran, and therefore this is also our methodology when we affirm for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So this is an important detail to be aware of. In the previous lesson, we established, broadly speaking, that we affirm for Allah whatever He affirmed for Himself and what His Messenger affirmed for Himself. And we negate for Allah whatever Allah negated from Himself and whatever His Messenger negated from Him. In this lesson, what we are doing is we are looking in more detail about the affirmation itself. What is the nature of this affirmation? How are we affirming? And how do we differ from the people of innovation and misguidance when we affirm things for Allah? We do it in a very specific and a detailed sense, because this is exactly what the Quran and the Sunnah came with, right? We do not use vague, general language, and to speak in generalities and obscurities. Like we don't say, for example, Allah is one. Allah is one in His essence. Allah is one in His being. And, we speak just in vague or generalizations and stop there. Because here, nothing of the perfection of Allah really becomes apparent, and nor is there any love inculcated into the hearts. So we don't see any of this. Whereas if we say Allah is one, having no partner, and He is Ar-Rahman, the most merciful, full of mercy. He's Ar-Rahim, merciful to His slaves. Al-Malik, the King. Al-Quddus, the sanctified. He is Al-Aziz, the mighty. Al-Hakim, the all-wise. Al-Sami', Al-Basir, the all-hearing, the all-seeing, and so on and so forth. Now, the more you hear, the more you are informed like this of the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then the more the perfection of Allah becomes apparent, right? So this is as it relates to the affirmation, as Shaykh Ibn Uthaymeen says in his commentary, that the methodology of the Quran, at-tafsil ghalibun fil ithbat, right? So when it comes to affirmation, we see overwhelmingly the majority case is that we see it being done specifically and in detail, right? So this is affirmation. Then the Shaykh continues and he says, وَأَمَّا الصِّفَاتُ الْمَنْفِيَةُ التي نفاها الله عن نفسه فكلها صفات نقص ولا تليق به كالعجز والتعب والظلم ومماثلة المخلوقين والغالب فيها الإجمال لأن ذلك أبلغ في تعظيم الموصوف وأكمل في التنزيه فإن تفصيلها لغير سبب يقتضيه فيه سخرية وتنقص للموصوف. So he says, now speaking about negation, as for the attributes which are negated, which Allah negated from Himself, then all of them are attributes of deficiency, and they are not befitting for Him, such as al-ajaz, being incapable, wa-ta'ab, being tired, wa-dhulm, being oppressive, unjust, and wa-mumathalat al-makhluqeen, resembling or being likened to the creation. All of these are negated for Allah. However, what we find that these types of things, they are negated only in a general sense. They are negated in a general sense. Why? Because negating deficiencies and doing so in a general sense is greater in venerating the one being so described, right? It is more far-reaching in praise of that being, that you negate only in a general sense, right? It's better for praise, and it's better in negation and better in indicating the perfection. Whereas if you were to make specific negations and you were to do so without there being a reason for you to do so, this would actually be counted as a type of, this would be counted as a type of mockery. It would be counted as a type of mockery and belittlement. And now the Shaykh goes on to explain and give some examples of this. If you were to say to a king, if you were stood in front of a king and you said to the king, Anta Kareem, Anta Kareem, Anta Shuja', Anta Muhannak, Qawiyul Hukm, Qahirun li'a'da'ik, right? If you were to stand in front of a king and you said, you are generous, you are brave, you are wise and experienced, you are strong in your judgment, you dominate your enemies, and other such things. See, now, because you are mentioning, you are making ithbat, affirmation, by way of tafsil, by way of detail, and you are mentioning specific qualities and attributes and titles, then all of this is considered to be a praise of the king. It's the greatest type of praise for the king. And also, by making apparent these qualities, by making mention of his mahasin, the good qualities, this then brings about love and respect in the hearts of the people. Why? Because, as the Shaykh says, لِأَنَّكَ فَصَّلْتَ فِي الْإِثْبَاتِ, because you have entered into detail in making ithbat. Now, so this is illustrating the first point about affirmation. Affirmation is in detail. Likewise, when it comes to negation, if you said to the king, Anta Malikun, you are the king, La yusamika ahadun min muluki dunya fi asrik. If you were to say to the king, you are the king and no one is equal to you, no one rivals or is equal to you from the kings of the world in your era, in your time. This would be a kind of, an excess, it would be like a far-reaching praise. Why? Because you have generalized the negation. You have generalized the negation. When you generalize a negation, you are basically negating, more extensively. And so it is more far-reaching in praise. You are a king, no one from the kings of the world, they equal you in your era. However, if, for example, you were to say, you are the king, let's say you are the king of, Sham or whatever it might be, you are the king of Andalus or whatever it might be, and, the kings of, the kings of Maghrib or the kings of Misr, they do not equal you. Okay, so now you haven't generalized the negation. You've only said that the kings of Misr or the kings of Maghrib, they do not equal you. But this does not mean that the kings of, for example, say a king in Khurasan or the king in some other place, that they might equal you, right? So you haven't generalized the negation. You've only made a specific negation, right? You are the king, and the kings of Maghrib, they do not equal or rival you. You've only made a specific negation. So when it comes to negation, the negation has to be generalized for it to be a far-reaching praise, right? You do not make negations specifically except with a reason. So now if you were to stand in front of the king And the Shaykh goes on to give the example. وَلَوْ قُلْتَ, if you were to say, أَنْتَ مَلِكٌ, you are the king, غَيْرُ بَخِيلٍ, you are not miserly, وَلَا جَبَّانٍ, nor are you a coward, وَلَا فَقِيرٌ, nor are you a pauper, وَلَا بَقَّالٍ, nor are you are not a greengrocer, وَلَا كَنَّاسٍ, you are not a road sweeper, وَلَا بَيْطَارٍ, you are not a vet, وَلَا حَجَّامٍ, you are not one who is a copper, the one who cups, does hijama on people, right? And you were to make all these negations. Are you really praising him, or are you mocking him? Are you making mockery of him by making these specific negations? Right? So the Shaykh says, this would be considered لَعَدَّ ذَلِكَ إِسْتِحْزَاءً بِهِ وَتَنَقُّصًا لِحَقِّهِ. This would be considered a mockery of him and a belittlement of his status, right? If you were to just speak just in terms of pure negations. So what this shows is, when it comes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in contrast to affirmation, we've seen the affirmation. Allah mentions names and attributes specifically in detail in all their types and variety. In contrast, when it comes to negation, we see that the general rule, al-ghalib, the overwhelming case with respect to negation, is that it is done only in a general sense. And what are examples of this? For example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He said, وَلَمْ يَكُلْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٍ. وَلَمْ يَكُلْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٍ. There is none which is an equal to Allah. Right? So this is a negation, and it is a generalized negation. Right? There is none which is an equal to Allah. Right? So this is an example of how negation is done in a general sense. Another example, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. There is none which is a likeness unto him. Again, this is a negation, but it is a generalized negation. Likewise, the statement of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, هَلْ تَعْلَمُ لَهُ سَمِيًّا. هَلْ تَعْلَمُ لَهُ سَمِيًّا, towards the end of Surah Maryam, chapter 19, verse number 65. هَلْ تَعْلَمُ لَهُ سَمِيًّا. Do you know of a namesake for him? Meaning, do you know of anyone else who has the name that he has, who deserves the name that he has? Meaning, there is no one. There is no one. Right? So this is a generalized negation in the form of a question. هَلْ تَعْلَمُ لَهُ سَمِيًّا. Meaning, no, there isn't any being or thing or person who deserves the names that he has, or the name that he has. Another example of a generalized negation, فَلَا تَجْعَلُوا لِلَّهِ أَنْدَادًا وَأَنْتُمْ تَعْلَمُونَ. At the beginning in Surah Al-Baqarah, do not make for Allah any rivals whilst you have knowledge. Meaning, Allah does not have any rivals. There are no rivals for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in His worship, in His lordship. Right? So we can see from all of these examples that negation is done in a general sense because it is greater in praise. It is greater in affirming perfection, that there is no one or no thing that equals or rivals or shares, with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So this is the methodology of the Quran. Negation is done in a general sense because that is more far-reaching in perfection, and affirmation is done in a specific and detailed sense because that is more far-reaching and greater in praise and affirmation of perfection. Right? And again, this is important to understand because, as we will see, the various groups and parties and factions and sects which appeared and deviated in this issue, whether those who ascribe to Islam or are from Islam, or whether they are from the other milal, the other religions, and beliefs and doctrines, such as the Falasifa, the Batiniyyah, the Yahud, the Nasara. We see that they oppose this divine methodology of the Quran. So they will either affirm only in a general sense, Allah is one, Allah is perfect, right? They will only affirm in a general sense, and they will negate in a detailed sense, right? Allah is not blind, Allah is not deaf, Allah is not unwise, Allah is not unjust, Allah is not this, Allah is not that, right? So and any speech that deviates from the way and the methodology of the revelation and of the messengers, then it is going to lead to misguidance. It is going to contain and lead to misguidance. So after this has been made clear, the Shaykh then goes on to explain that we've already established that the general approach when it comes to affirmation, it is to speak in detail and with specifics. And the general approach when it comes to negation is to speak in generalities, is to negate with generalizations. However, there are some exceptions, and that's why we said that the ghalib, right, the overwhelming, the majority situation is, in affirmation that you speak in detail. And the majority situation in negation is that you negate only in generalizations. However, there are some exceptions to this. And the Shaykh Ibn Uthaymeen, rahimahullah, is going to mention some examples to each, some exceptions to each of these two. So the first exception is that we see in the Quran that there are places in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has spoken of His names or attributes in a general sense. Right? So the clear example of this is when Allah says, وَلِلَّهِ الْأَسْمَاءُ الْحُسْنَى فَادْعُوهُ بِهَا. To Allah belongs the beautiful names, so call upon Him by way of them. So call upon Him by way of them. So here this is a general affirmation of the names of Allah. Right? So this is not done, in detail or in specifics. That is found elsewhere in the Quran, but in this particular verse we see a generalization. And the reason for this is because the situation demands a generalization, because what it means is it leaves the command open for it to apply to all of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So for example, if you wanted to ask Allah for rizq, for sustenance, you say, Ya Razzaq urzuqni. So you call upon Allah by the name that is appropriate. O Allah, who is the provider, Razzaq, provide for me. And if you were to ask Allah for mercy, Ya Rahman, Ya Rahim, irhamni. O one who is filled with mercy, O one who is merciful to His slaves, show mercy to me. And so on and so forth. Right? You use the particular name that is relevant to the thing which you are asking. For this reason, in this ayah, وَلِلَّهِ الْأَسْمَاءُ الْحُسْنَى فَادْعُوهُ بِهَا, it was left general so that it can be applicable, universally to all of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is an exception to the general kind of principle that we see in the Quran of Allah's names being mentioned in detail. And it is an exception because there is a reason, there is a ma'na, there's a meaning, for that. Similarly, the statement of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when it comes to the attributes. He said, وَلِلَّهِ الْمَثَلُ الْأَعْلَى. وَلِلَّهِ الْمَثَلُ الْأَعْلَى. To Allah belongs the loftiest example. The loftiest example. And the meaning of mathal, al-mathal here, meaning al-wasf. Al-wasf, meaning the description. To Allah belongs the loftiest description. right? Al-mathal, the meaning of the word al-mathal here is al-wasf. And the proof for that, Shaykh ibn Uthaymeen, rahimahullah, he brings a proof for that, and he says, if you look in Surah Muhammad, for example, the 47th chapter, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is describing paradise, he says, مَثَلُ الْجَنَّةِ الَّتِي وُعِدَ الْمُتَّقُونَ فِيهَا أَنْحَارٌ مِّن مَاءٍ غَيْرِ آسٍ. He says, the mathal of the paradise which the pious have been promised. And then the ayah continues to mention, that there are certain rivers therein, rivers of water, rivers of wine, rivers of milk, rivers of honey. Then the meaning here is that this is the description of the paradise, the wasf of the paradise which the believers have been promised. So mathal meaning wasf. And so therefore when Allah says, وَلِلَّهِ الْمَثَلُ الْأَعْلَى, to Allah belongs the best likeness or similitude, meaning to Allah belongs the loftiest wasf, the description. And so this is a generalization for all of the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This ayah, or this section of the ayah, وَلِلَّهِ الْمَثَلُ الْأَعْلَى, this is a generalized affirmation of all of the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. To Allah belong the loftiest attributes. So once again, this has been mentioned in general, but again, there is a reason and there's a meaning behind this, and it is to affirm in a general sense all of the loftiest attributes for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, like in a single sentence, in a single statement. But this does not mean that overwhelmingly the way of the Quran is to actually mention the attributes in detail, right? So this is an exception to the general approach of the Quran. So this now is clear. We see that for affirmation, overwhelmingly we stick to the detail that the Quran has come with, mentioning the attributes and the names in detail as the Quran has come with. But we do see certain texts in which there is a generalization, right? But that is not the general rule. Likewise with negation, just like we established that the general rule in negation is that we negate in a general sense. لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ هَلْ تَعْلَمُ لَهُ سَمِيًّا وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٌ. Right? We are negating in a general sense. However, we do find in the Quran negation in a specific sense, but that is because there is a reason to do that, right? There is a reason to make the negation. And this is when there is, for example, let's give some examples. The example given by Shaykh ibn Uthaymeen, rahimahullah, is, for example, the Christians making a claim that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a walad, Allah has a son. And so for that reason, Allah has negated that He has a son. This is a specific negation. مَا اتَّخَذَ اللَّهُ مِنْ وَلَدٍ وَمَا كَانَ مَعَهُ مِنْ إِلَهٍ. Here Allah has negated, Allah has not taken a son, nor is there alongside Him any deity. Right? So this is now a specific negation of what the Christians, the accusation made by the Christians, and likewise the Yahud, and likewise also we see negated in the Quran, Allah negating that He has daughters, because the pagan Arabs claimed that the angels are the daughters of Allah. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He negated this from Himself, as we see at the end of Surah Safat, the 37th chapter. We see Allah negates Astafal Banati ala al-Banin. Has He chosen daughters for Himself over sons? Ma lakum kayfa tahkumun. What is with you? How do you judge? Right? So because this was the accusation being made by the pagan Arabs, that Allah has taken daughters, the angels are the daughters of Allah. So Allah negated that specifically in numerous places in the Quran. And likewise also the negation that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has wronged anybody. وَمَا ظَلَمْنَاهُمْ وَلَكِنْ ظَلَمُوا أَنفُسَهُم. We did not wrong them, but they are the ones who wrong themselves, just in case that there might be someone who might make a presumption that Allah, when He punishes a people, that this is somehow injustice, right? So this is a situation where Allah has negated something specifically in order to remove the, tawahhum, right? The presumption or the thought that somebody might have. Similarly, the negation of that Allah is miserly or greedy or stingy, as was claimed by the Yahud. When they said وَقَالَتِ الْيَهُودِ يَدُ اللَّهِ مَغْلُولَةٌ, and the Yahud, they say Allah's hand is tied. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He negated this and غُلَّتْ أَيْدِيهِمْ, may their hands be tied. And بَلْ يَدَاهُ مَبْسُوطَتَانِ, rather, both His hands are outstretched, right? So all of these are examples in which a specific negation has been made because there's a reason or a situation which demands that, right? It is not a general rule or a general principle. One more example given by Shaykh Ibn Uthaymeen rahimahullah is that the verse وَلَقَدْ خَلَقَنَا السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَمَا بَيْنَهُمَا فِي سِتَّةِ أَيَّامٍ وَمَا مَسَّنَا مِن لُغُوبٍ. This is in Surah Qaf. We created the heavens and the earth and what is between them in 6 days, and no tiredness, no weariness touched us. Why? Because this might be a place where someone might presume that if Allah created this mighty creation, then perhaps He might have been fatigued or, So in order to rebut that presumption, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He made that negation, وَمَا مَسَّنَا مِن لُغُوبٍ, and we were not touched by any, weariness or tiredness. وَلَا يَؤُودُهُ حِفْظُهُمَا, as we see in Ayatul Kursi, when Allah mentions the creation of the heavens and the earth, and everything belongs to Him and the dominion belongs to Him. So to rebut the presumption that maybe there's some toll or weariness or tiredness upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He negated that preserving them and maintaining them does not tire Him. So in all of these situations, we see these are specific negations, but these negations have been made because of a sabab, because of reasons that actually require that, or in that context. So once again, negation, the general methodology is that it is done in a generalized sense. لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٌ هَلْ تَعْلَمُ لَهُ سَمِيًّا. This is done in a general sense. And there are probably other examples in the Quran similar to that. But there are some exceptions, but those are exceptions. Those exceptions are obviously, they are the exception. They are not the rule, right? We do not see in the Quran Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saying that Allah is not deaf, Allah is not blind, Allah is not unwise, Allah is not unjust, Allah is not weak, Allah is not this, that. We don't find that in the Quran, right? And the examples that we do find where there is a negation, then that negation, if it's done specifically, then there are reasons for that. And if it's done generally, then that is the general rule that we find in the Quran when it comes to negating shortcomings and defects, from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is done in a general sense because that is greater in praise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So now that all of this has become clear, we spoke in this lesson of affirmation and the nature of the affirmation that has come in the Quran and the Sunnah, and negation and the nature of the negation which has come in the Quran and the Sunnah, and how we adhere to this. We adhere to this methodology that we always affirm in a specific sense and we always negate in a general sense, unless there is a specific reason to bring a specific negation, like the examples we gave in the Quran of negating a son from Allah, of negating that Allah is stingy, of negating that Allah becomes tired after creating what He creates, or managing and preserving what He creates. No, right? These things are negated because there's a reason to do so, either because of accusations made by people, or in case there is a tawahhum, there is like a thought that emanates in the mind of someone that might, just a mere presumption, and in order to remove that presumption and to stop that presumption, right? So they have a reason why these negations are specific. So to wind our lesson down, to close our lesson, just to make a quick summary then, that Shaykh Ibn Uthaymeen rahimahullah himself has given of this section. So first of all, first point would be that the attributes of Allah, they are either thubutiyah or manfiyah. The attributes of Allah are either affirmed attributes or they are negated attributes, right? So whatever Allah is described with, it is either affirmatory or it is negatory. The second point is that the sifat, as-sifatu thubutiyah, kulluha sifatu kamalin la naqsa fiha. All the attributes of Allah, they are attributes of perfection for Him. There is no deficiency therein. So for example, when we speak of the sight of Allah and the hearing of Allah and the ilm of Allah, we also have sight and hearing and knowledge. But in our sight, hearing and knowledge, there is deficiency. Right? Our sight is limited, our hearing is limited, our knowledge is limited. For Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, these attributes which He has, they are attributes of perfection. There is no deficiency in these attributes, unlike what we find in the creation. All the attributes in the creation that we have, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also has, then in our attributes there is deficiency. Right? So we have qudra, we have power, but our power is deficient. We have life, hayat, right? But it is followed by death, and it was preceded by death. Whereas Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His life is perfect. It is not preceded by death, nor is it followed by death, right? And the same applies to all of the other attributes of Allah. The attributes that we have, which Allah has, like we said, life, hearing, seeing, will, power, and so on and so forth, right? There is no deficiency in the attributes of Allah. They are perfect, but there is deficiency in our attributes, right? So those attributes we affirm for Allah, they are all perfect without any deficiency there. And that's the second point. The third point is that all of the negated attributes, the attributes negated for Allah, they are attributes of deficiency. They are attributes of imperfection. They are negated for Allah. However, when we negate them for Allah, then they comprise the perfect opposite. They comprise the perfect opposite, right? So when, for example, when we say, lam yalid wa lam yulad, Allah neither begot nor was He begotten. When we negate that Allah gave birth or was given birth to, what are we affirming? We are affirming the complete opposite, that Allah is as-samad. As-samad, right? As-samad, one of the meanings of as-samad, meaning that nothing emanates from Him, right? Meaning that He doesn't give birth So we affirm the perfect opposite. Allah is ahad, Allah is as-samad, right? So every negation of something which is imperfect, then the opposite is automatically affirmed by way of that. When we negate dhulm from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even though He is able to do dhulm, He chooses not to do so, which means perfect justice, kamalul adal, perfect justice. We affirm that for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And likewise, when we negate that Allah, the negation of the accusation of being miserly, then Allah is Jawad, Allah is generous, Allah is Kareem, Allah is generous and kind. The perfect opposite is being affirmed. So the negated attributes, they are negated because they are imperfections. And when we negate them from Allah, the perfect opposites are automatically affirmed for Him at the same time. This is point number 3. Point number 4, in light of this, overwhelmingly the methodology of the Quran is to affirm in a specific and a detailed sense. Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, Al-Malik, Al-Quddus, As-Salam. Allah has ilm, Allah has hikmah, Allah is wise, Allah is merciful, Allah becomes angry, Allah becomes pleased, Allah forgives, and so on and so forth, right? And this is greater in affirmation of praise. And as for negation, then negation overwhelmingly, there is ijmal, right? Meaning it is done in a generalized sense, because that also is greater in highlighting the perfection. You do not negate in a specific sense, right? Unless there is a need to do so, as has been made clear. And finally, the final point is that yes, sometimes affirmation might be done in a general sense for a reason, and negation might be done in a specific sense also for a reason, and there were some examples given for both of those two situations. So this brings us to a close for today's lesson. In today's lesson, we expanded a bit more on the issue of affirmation and negation. So now we should have a clearer understanding that, when we affirm, we do so in a specific way, and when we negate, we do so in a generalized way, and this makes us different and distinct from the people of innovation and misguidance, and from the falasifa and the batiniyyah and others, all of whom have opposed the methodology of the Quran and of the messengers in a variety of different ways that inshallah ta'ala we are going to look at in future lessons in this series. So with that, we can conclude our lesson there for today. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een.